There is a thought most of us have learned without anyone teaching us to keep at a certain distance. Not to suppress it entirely, that would require too much effort, but to hold it just far enough away that it never quite lands. We become expert at this. We fill our hours with the right amount of noise, the right amount of motion, and the thought stays where we need it to stay, acknowledged in principle, unfelt in practice. The thought is simply this, that you will die. Not as a fact about human beings in general, not as a statistical certainty that applies to everyone and therefore somehow to no one, but as something particular and inescapable, that the specific weight of your consciousness, the texture of your experience, the private interior weather of your life, will one day stop, completely, without exception made for you. When that thought does land, and occasionally, in the right kind of quiet, it does something shifts, not always into fear, though fear is one possibility. Sometimes it shifts into a strange clarity. The room you are sitting in becomes more precisely itself. The people you love appear, briefly, in sharper focus. Even something as ordinary as light coming through a window can take on a quality it did not have a moment before. As though death, approaching for just a second, had briefly cleaned the glass through which you see everything else. This is not morbidity. Morbidity is a kind of wallowing, a turning toward decay for its own sake, a fascination that feeds on itself and goes nowhere. What we are talking about is something altogether different, a thinking that uses the fact of mortality as a lens, and asks what becomes visible when you hold that lens steadily rather than set it down. Many serious minds have held it steadily, and what they found when they did is that death does not simply end the conversation about how to live. It very nearly begins it. In the middle of the 16th century, a French nobleman retired from public life, climbed to the tower of his and began to do something almost no one in his era thought worth doing. He wrote about himself. Had watched plague move through his countryside. He had buried close friends. He had survived a riding accident that left him briefly convinced he was dying. And in that brief suspension between life and its end, he noticed something strange, that the dying in that moment was not as terrible as the anticipating had been. He was not a monk meditating on skulls, not a theologian armed with promises of heaven. He was a restless, curious, sometimes anxious man who had simply decided that the one subject everyone avoided was the one most worth sitting with. And so he sat with it, for years, in essays that circle and return and revise themselves like a mind, genuinely thinking rather than a doctrine being delivered. His starting point is almost provokingly simple. We suffer from death long before it arrives. The dread, the flinching, the elaborate arrangements we make to avoid the thought, these are themselves a kind of dying, drawn out across a lifetime. Observed that most people lived as though death were an interruption, something that would happen later, to a future self who would somehow be more prepared. But later never comes equipped with preparation. It comes equipped only with itself. And so the anxious deferral simply compounds. What he proposed instead was not stoic resignation or religious surrender, but something more intimate and more demanding, familiarity. To think about death often and plainly and without theater until it loses the power of the unfamiliar. He borrowed from the ancient Stoics, yes, from Seneca especially, but he bent the inheritance toward something distinctly his own, where Seneca could feel like a man steeling himself for an ordeal, felt like a man learning to relax into an obvious truth. Death is not an enemy that can be outmaneuvered. It is not a punishment for some failure of virtue. It is simply the condition under which everything human happens. To befriend it, then, is not to become morbid. It is to become, at last, honest about the terms of one's existence. And in that honesty, something loosens. The energy spent in avoidance becomes available for living. The hours stop feeling like a countdown and begin feeling like what they actually are, sufficient in themselves. What discovered in his tower, through years of self-examination, was that learning how to die and learning how to live were not two separate projects. They were one project, approached from different ends. To take death seriously was to take the present moment seriously. To stop treating the current afternoon as a waiting room for some more real occasion yet to come. He did not solve death. He did not dissolve the grief or the fear entirely. But he demonstrated, in the way only a genuinely examined life can demonstrate, that thinking clearly about the end of things is where seriousness about life has always had to begin. Made his peace with death from a library chair, surrounded by books and the smell of a French country winter. Socrates made his on the last morning of his life, in an Athenian prison cell, surrounded by weeping friends, and he made it not as resignation but as argument. What separates him from is not courage, which both possessed in abundance, but the formal severity of his claim. That philosophy, properly understood, is not merely reconciled to death but is constituted by it. To philosophize is already, in some precise sense, to be dying. Socrates spent his life as a public irritant in one of history's most self-satisfied cities. He owned almost nothing, refused almost every comfort, and dedicated every waking hour to a single obsession: the question of what it means to know something, and whether he or anyone actually did. This was not an eccentric hobby. For Socrates, clarity of mind was the only thing that made a human life genuinely human, and clarity of mind had an enemy: the body. Not the body as flesh exactly, but the body as appetite, as clamor, as the constant pressure of desire and sensation and fear that fills the inner life with noise.
The body is a source of endless trouble to us by reason of the mere requirement of food, and is also liable to diseases which overtake and impede us in the search after truth, and by filling us so full of loves and lusts and fears and fancies and idols and every sort of folly, prevents our ever having, as people say, so much as a thought.
From this diagnosis, the argument unfolds with a strange cleanness. If the body is the obstruction, and if philosophy is the effort to see past obstruction toward truth, then philosophy is precisely the practice of loosening the soul's entanglement with bodily noise, withdrawing attention from appetite, from sensation, from the fear of pain and the craving for pleasure. And what is that withdrawal, taken to its limit if not death? Death, on this account, is not the enemy of the philosophical life. It is its destination, the condition in which the soul, finally unencumbered, might achieve what it was always reaching for.
Either knowledge is not to be attained at all, or if at all, after death. For then, and not then, the soul will be in herself alone, and without the body.
There is something austere here that we should not rush past. Socrates is not offering comfort, exactly. He is making a structural claim about what philosophy demands. Every act of genuine thought requires a kind of dying, a willingness to let go of what the body insists upon, what habit and fear and appetite insist upon, in order to see more clearly. The philosopher who spends a lifetime in that practice and then recoils from death has, in Socrates' view, failed to understand what he was doing all along. He said as much to his friends in that cell, with a directness that must have felt almost cruel in the circumstances. The true disciple of philosophy, he told them, has always been pursuing death. To repine at the last step would be to have missed the whole journey. What Socrates offers, then, is not the warm domestication of death that counseled. It is something colder and more demanding, a transformation of the self so thorough that death ceases to appear as loss. The fear of death is, for him, finally a symptom evidence that the self is still gripping the body, still mistaking appetite for identity. Philosophy, at its most serious, is the long practice of opening that grip, and it takes, as he demonstrated on his last afternoon, an entire life. Socrates died at peace, certain that something essential in him would survive. That philosophy had been a long rehearsal for the moment of release. But what if there is nothing to release? What if the self that Socrates trusted to carry wisdom beyond the threshold was never more than a convenient fiction, a temporary eddy in a current that has no interest in it whatsoever? This is where Arthur begins. He was born in Danzig in 1788, the son of a successful merchant and a novelist mother who found him, by most accounts, genuinely difficult. He grew into a solitary, combative man, brilliant and bitter in roughly equal measure, who spent long decades in Frankfurt writing philosophy that almost no one read, feeding his poodles, and watching the world confirm his darkest suspicions about it. When his ideas finally reached an audience, late in his life, he received them with the satisfaction of someone who had always known he was right. He had studied Kant and been transfixed by the Hindu Upanishads and Buddhist thought, and out of these very different traditions, he built a system as cold and as honest as anything Western philosophy has produced. At the center of that system is the will. Not your will or mine, not a preference or a decision, but something far more impersonal. Means the blind, restless force that drives all matter, all life, all striving. The pull of gravity, the urgency of hunger, the relentless pressure of sexual desire, the way a plant pushes toward light without knowing why. Beneath the surface of every individual thing, beneath what Kant called the world of appearances, there is only this one undifferentiated, purposeless surge of wanting. We are not beings who have desires. We are desire, briefly organized into a shape that calls itself a person. And death in this picture is the dissolution of that shape. The individual dies and there is no soul waiting in the wings, no platonic realm of forms where the best part of you finally arrives home. There is only the will, which does not mourn its instruments because it never needed them to be permanent. It simply moves on, takes another form, winds up again.
Every time a man is begotten and born, the clock of human life is wound up anew to repeat once more its same old tune that has already been played innumerable times, movement by movement and measure by measure, with insignificant variations.
There is something almost vertiginous in that image, not the comfort of a soul ascending, but the indifference of a mechanism resetting. Your life, with everything you have loved and feared and worked for, is a single playing of a tune that has no beginning and will have no end. The music does not care about any particular performance. This is what separates so sharply from Socrates. Socrates saw death as the teacher who finally completes the lesson, sees it as the proof that there was no lesson, only the ceaseless, grinding repetition of the will expressing itself through forms that believe, briefly and incorrectly, that they matter. And yet, and this is crucial, does not leave us there entirely without a response. If the will is the source of all suffering, since willing is by definition a state of lack, of not yet having, then the only genuine liberation is to turn against it, to want less, to loosen the grip of desire, of ambition, of the ordinary animal urgency to continue. He found this not in Socratic reason, but in asceticism, in art, in the quieting of the self. Death, in the end, points toward what might make life bearable, not striving harder but consenting slowly to want less of it. It is a dark counsel, but it is one that takes seriously what Socrates could not quite bring himself to say, that the self asking the question may be precisely the thing that needs to go. Gave us a will that grinds on without us, indifferent to whether we persist or perish. It is a bleak inheritance, but consider what happens when a man of immense worldly power, not a reclusive philosopher but the ruler of the largest empire on earth, arrives at very nearly the same conclusions about impermanence, and finds in them not despair but a quiet, almost severe reason to live well. That man is, and the place to meet him is not in his public life, but in the private journal he kept during military campaigns on the Danube frontier in the last decade of his life. He never intended it for readers. He was writing to steady himself. Governed Rome from 161 to 180 CE, years marked by plague, war, and the endless administrative weight of an empire in slow decline. He had read the Stoics deeply, Epictetus above all, and had absorbed their central conviction, that what matters is not what happens to you but how your mind meets it. Death, for the Stoics, was simply one more thing that happens to you. The question was always the same: will you meet it with clarity or with noise? What makes distinctive is that he strips the question down to something almost anatomical. He refuses consolation. He will not reach, as Socrates did, toward the soul's immortality or the philosopher's reward. He looks at himself with a kind of cool, unsentimental precision.
Whatever this is that I am, it is flesh and a little spirit and an intelligence. Hay's translation.
Flesh, spirit, intelligence. That is the inventory. No grand metaphysical claim follows. What follows instead is a conclusion that might seem deflationary but is actually clarifying. If this is all you are, then the dissolution of it is simply a return of borrowed materials to the whole from which they came. The atoms reassemble elsewhere. The pattern you called yourself disperses. Finds this not tragic but almost restful, a homecoming into the ordinary fabric of things. He writes of emperors and philosophers alike, all gone, all absorbed back into the ground of existence. The universe is transformation, he says, and life is opinion. But here is where parts ways with any philosophy that uses impermanence merely as a reason for resignation. For him, the awareness of death is not a sedative, it is a pressure. It sharpens the present moment into something urgent and specific, and he makes the urgency concrete.
There is a limit to the time assigned you, and if you don't use it to free yourself, it will be gone and never return. Hay's translation.
Freedom here means something precise. Freedom from the machinery of reaction, from the habits of irritability and self-deception that consume a life from the inside. Death, in his hands, becomes a kind of ethical alarm, not memento as morbid ornament, but as a practical tool for recovering attention. Each action done as though it were the last, not dramatically, not with theatrical weight, but with full presence and honesty, is an action rescued from the waste that distraction makes of ordinary days. The man writing these words controlled armies and provinces. He still had to remind himself daily to pay attention. That, perhaps, is the most humanizing thing about him. Power did not exempt him from the difficulty of being present. Death, held steadily in view, was what made presence possible. Found his peace by letting the self grow quiet, by allowing the individual life to settle back into the vast rational order from which it had briefly emerged. It is a serene philosophy, and in its way a beautiful one. But Albert Camus would have none of it. For Camus, the self is not something to be dissolved. It is the very thing at stake, and its hunger, its refusal to accept silence for an answer, is not a weakness to be corrected but the central, anguished dignity of being human. Camus was born in 1913 in colonial Algeria, in poverty, under a North African sun that burned its way into nearly everything he wrote. He lost his father to the First World War before he could remember him. He was raised by a mother who barely spoke. He contracted tuberculosis as a young man and lived for decades with the knowledge that his body might fail him suddenly, without negotiation. He was not theorizing about mortality from a comfortable distance. He was writing from inside it. And when he turned to the question of death, he brought with him not just a philosopher's intelligence, but a man's specific, embodied dread. The move Camus makes, and it is the move that defines him, is to refuse every available consolation while refusing equally to despair. He surveys the situation with full clarity. We are creatures who need meaning, and the universe offers none. We are mortal, and no rational framework dissolves the wrongness of that. What he calls the absurd is precisely this collision, not death itself, not meaninglessness itself, but the gap between our hunger and the world's silence. And crucially, he insists that the honest thing is not to close that gap, not to leap toward God, not to embrace stoic resignation, not to pretend the wound is anything other than a wound.
Don't let them tell us stories. Don't let them say of the man sentenced to death, he is going to pay his debt to society. But they are going to cut off his head. It looks like nothing, but it does make a little difference. And then there are people who prefer to look their fate in the eye.
That insistence on plain sight, on stripping language of its sedatives, is where Camus locates integrity. Because once you see death clearly, once you refuse the softening stories, something unexpected becomes possible. Not peace exactly, not the Stoics' equanimity, something more volatile and more alive, rebellion. To know you will die and to love your life anyway without pretending the contradiction resolves is for Camus the only response that does not betray the truth of your situation.
There is not love of life without despair about life.
He means this literally. The love is not possible at the comfortable distance where despair has been set aside. It requires the despair as its ground, the way a note requires silence to be heard at all. And so death, for Camus, is not a teacher who brings wisdom, not a tyrant to be outwitted, not a mirror in which we glimpse the eternal. It is the hard, irreducible limit that gives everything on this side of it its specific weight and warmth.
Knowing that certain nights whose sweetness lingers will keep returning to the earth and see after we are gone. Yes, this helps us to die.
Not because the world's continuance compensates us. It doesn't, and Camus would be the first to say so. But because the beauty that will outlast us is the same beauty we are alive to right now. To feel that fully, without flinching from the fact that it will end, is the thing he is pointing toward. Not transcendence, presence. The invincible summer he once wrote of finding inside himself in the middle of winter, that is what remains when all the consoling stories have been cleared away. Not hope, not resignation, but a lucid, wide-open love of this exact life, held with both hands, precisely because it cannot be held forever. So we have traveled through several minds, each of them circling the same darkness from a different angle, coaxing us toward familiarity. Socrates meeting the hemlock with something very close to curiosity, insisting that what we take to be our individual life is borrowed from a force that will simply lend itself to someone else. Returning again and again to the brief candle, not in despair but as a kind of discipline. And Camus, refusing comfort entirely, asking us to hold the absurd without flinching and still, somehow to choose. What strikes me, sitting with all of this, is not that these men agreed. They did not. What strikes me is that each of them became more awake to life precisely in proportion to how seriously they took its ending. The confrontation did not shrink them. It clarified them. And yet I want to resist the temptation to hand you that as a consolation, as though the thought of death were a tonic you could take and feel better. Because the honest thing is that none of these thinkers fully dissolved the difficulty, still had to practice. Socrates still had to drink. Camus still had to get up in the morning in a universe that offered him nothing in return. What death seems to do at its most searching is remove a certain kind of padding between you and your actual life. The future stops being an infinite deferral. The present becomes, if not easier, then at least undeniable. You are here. This moment is occurring, and it will not occur again. That is not a comfort. It is something more demanding than comfort. It is an invitation to a kind of attention that most of us spend considerable energy avoiding. What you do with that attention, whether you find in it terror or freedom or something that refuses to be named, that, I think, is where the real thinking begins.